lost the game, because you've accepted the parameters set by that who gives you the terms of the discourse. So, I mean, and to even bring this closer to mind, if when someone comes, as often, someone will come and say, I want to work on Islam and women. My immediately, it's a completely meaningless topic. What does it mean to work on Islam and women? I mean, and it's a perfect example of the way that we internalize prejudices and various assumptions that others give. And sticking with that example of Islam, students that say want to work on someone, there are periods in role played by gendered individuals, women, in the early life of the Muslim community in Medina, and then a different role played by women of Medina and women of Kufa in the 20 years after the death of the Prophet, which was quite different from the role played by women in Syria 20 years after the death of the Prophet, which was yet now 100 years after the death of the Prophet. The role played by women in Syria is quite different from the role played by women in Egypt 100 years after the death of the Prophet. When you plug in certain facts, so for instance, when you learn that in 16th century Egypt, most lands that were privately owned were owned by women. Very few lands were actually owned by men, and that makes you wonder, well, how did that take place, and what does that say about that larger subject of Islam and women? Or that professorial positions in the University of Damascus and Azhar University in the 12th century, it was far more common to have chairs occupied by chairs in Islamic law or Islamic theology or Islamic Islamics generally, occupied by women, and so it's. And at what point can you lend yourself to a generalization, but yet think of the amount of pressure that is on us to accept these dumbed down categories. So if you go to a publisher and you say, I want to write a book about Muslim women in Kufa in 9th century, the publisher will say, well, I can sell about 100 copies of that book. If you write it, I'll price the book at $150 a copy. The publisher is pressuring you to talk about Islam and women. Imagine if ABC calls you and you say, well, I'll give you an interview, but I can only talk about women in the Ma'adi area of Egypt, or women who are graduates of American University of Cairo, but I cannot really comment about women who are graduates of Azhar University in Cairo. That ABC reporter is going to say, well, thank you very much, move on to the next person who's willing to just talk about Islam and women, that big, flat subject. Even professors and in your own, if you tell, or in, as you represent yourself as an expert or as a student, you say, well, I am. It sounds far sexier to talk about that I'm studying Islam and women than I'm studying some sub issue. This is, the more the more our sophistication about a subject becomes, the more our minds accepts qualifications. I mean, examine your own mind as you grow up. You know, the younger you are as a child, unless you're a particular genius, you know, you tend to want to see mathematics, for instance, in simple dynamics of addition and subtraction and maybe multiplication. But as your intellectual abilities expand, you start moving from various conceptions of what mathematics can be, and to the point that mathematics no longer need numbers. Mathematics can become something that dispenses with numbers altogether. And now take this in whatever you consider your own familiar context. I mean, if I come and I say, you know, write me a paper about you and your family, immediately you start thinking of individuals within your family, and then you think, is there anything that actually unifies these units? The more remote anything is, the easier it becomes to generalize about it. And that's why, you know, usually, as a rule of thumb, students who know less are always the ones who want to write the bigger topics. You know, students who, for instance, know very little about constitutional law, they'll come in and say, oh, I want to do a paper on American constitutional law. But students who actually know something about American constitutional law will know that such a paper is an F paper before you even started writing it. It is what part of American constitutional law? And even if you break it down to amendments, what aspect of a particular amendment are you talking about? I mean, Islam is imagine if a constitutional document, I mean, I often say this to my students, imagine if a constitutional document that is 200 plus years old is a level of, you cannot talk about this constitutional document without a million qualifiers to even respect yourself at all. So, you know, you would need to qualify any thought about this constitutional document in terms of periods, in terms of sections, in terms of schools of thought, in terms of orientations, and so on. Now, imagine if you, instead of a constitutional document that's 20 pages or so, you take a text that inspired millions of people through centuries, like the text of the Quran or the text of the Bible, or even the poetry of Rumi. I mean, one of the things that I find fascinating and remarkable is that you'll find people not willing to generalize about the poetry of Rumi, people who have an appreciation of Rumi. You know, the minute you say anything about the poetry of Rumi, you say, well, you know, you have to think about this, you have to... But they are willing to generalize about the text of the Quran as if it's a simpler text, or as if it is... that is the... You know, this is an introductory course. If your course does nothing else than tell you should respect yourself, you should have enough respect, self-respect. You should have enough self-respect not to generalize about institutions that are as layered and varied and multidimensional as the humans who have embodied these institutions through the centuries. That's an achievement in itself. I mean, I don't know if it's possible to generalize about even Muslims living in our age. Um, if examine the moment we are in, when and here someone who's lived all his life as Muslim, I've read more books than I can count about various aspects of Islam and so on. The Muslims I meet in Indonesia, at different parts of Indonesia, and that even gets more complicated. The Muslims of Sumatra are very different than the Muslims that I meet in some other. I'm sorry, Indonesia. Sorry. Or the Muslims of Malaysia are quite distinct and separate than Muslims of Egypt. Even the Muslims of Egypt, they are so many various orientations, and some who are we right now have a constitutional referendum about some constitutional amendments, and the extent of nuance is mind-boggling. Or if you look at just you think about the Muslims of Libya, compare them with the Muslims of Tunisia, compare them with the Muslims of Bahrain, compare them with the Muslims of Yemen. The picture it constantly tells you that Islam is just you get the same message about all human institutions. That the story is that any generalization challenges the maker of the generalization more than informs the subject upon which the generalization is issued. And so, what texts are you reading? Anything for the book, for the course?
We mostly have small, online articles that we assign, or we'll just talk about them in class. One reading that we did have was from Esposito, which is Islam, the Straight Path. Yeah. And we had a couple of Rumi, poetry.
You had Rumi?
Or poems that we... Yeah, I'm a really big enthusiast when it comes to Rumi and Sufi
wow,
poetry.
I'm impressed. Quite often people... Rumi is the best-selling poet in the West. Continues to be. But what's remarkable is that he does not fit with stereotypes of Muslims to such an extent that many of the people who study Rumi pretend that nothing in his poetry had anything to do with his Islamic identity and his Islamic character. While, from my perspective, it's laughable. I mean, I've actually read people who said, well, Rumi wasn't really Muslim. Rumi didn't really believe in God anyway. It's just mind-boggling. And talk about prejudice. I mean, when Rumi's... Do you know anything about his life and his personal legacy?
Sufi.
Well, yes, of course, but I mean, he lived. Rumi even studied Islamic theology.
He was a Hafiz.
Yeah, and of course he had. Yeah, he was a Hafiz. But his whole he's completely submerged in Islamic culture, and like a lot of the other Sufis, Hafiz as well, or Hallaj, or I mean they are very much a real embodiment of Islam as the way we think. In fact, in my view, Rumi is far more an embodiment of Islamicities, plural, than bin Laden. Because bin Laden experienced Islam within a highly politicized context. He was born in Saudi Arabia, he's confronted by a Soviet invasion that he feels very strongly about. He has a certain relationship with a royal family, and it's his dynamics with Islam, his relationship with Islamic culture is extremely politicized and extremely a no holds bar game. I mean, it's a winner take nothing game. The very sharp, not very nuanced relations of power that Bin Laden grows up with. While Rumi studied various articulations of Islamic culture in a variety of contexts. I mean, he lives as a Muslim theologian for a while, he lives as a Muslim jurist for a while, he lives as a sort of a vagabond, one of the vulgar masses for a while, and then he meets his great master, who he considers equal the path to God, in his personal prophet to God, his Shamsuddin, which he directed all his poetry to, and so such a sophisticated and multi-layered intonations of Islamicities. And now imagine the irony and the obscenity of people talking about Bin Laden as a representative of Islamicity far more than they do of Rumi. I mean, Bin Laden might actually tells me far less about Islamic culture than someone like Rumi. Have you read Ibn Arabi, or have you assigned any Ibn Arabi? I mean, it's quite interesting, because there's a certain flattened Islam that grew up with the puritanical movement. The sometimes called Salafis or Wahhabi or whatever you want to call it. But it's a movement that the various historical nuances. So, and it's never a solution for someone who is well informed to say,